My name is Frank Whitfield, and I am 74 years old. 3 weeks before Christmas last year, my son opened the envelope I'd handed him at our family gathering, glanced at the modest check folded inside, $40, the same amount I had given him every single year since he'd turned 18, and let out a short, sharp laugh in front of his wife and both of his children before setting it down on the side table without another word, the way you'd set down a flyer for a service you had no intention of using. What my son didn't know, and what his wife certainly had no way of knowing, was that 6 months earlier, sitting at my kitchen table with a calculator, a stack of bank statements, and a decision I'd been turning over in my mind for the better part of a year, I had quietly paid off the entire remaining balance of his mortgage, $162,000, in a single wire transfer that his own bank had processed without ever telling him where the money had actually come from. If you've ever given quietly, without asking for credit, and watched someone you love mistake that quiet for absence, stay with me until the end. This story isn't about proving my son wrong for underestimating me. It's about the strange, particular ache of loving someone enough to stay invisible, and what happens when invisibility finally runs out of road. Welcome to Silent Honor USA, where we tell true stories about the quiet strength it takes to be underestimated by the people who need you most. If this story moves you, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. And subscribe, because you're going to want to see exactly how this all came to light. I need to tell you who I was before that Christmas dinner, because otherwise a folded $40 check and a wire transfer won't carry the weight they're actually supposed to carry. I was born in 1951, outside of Zanesville, Ohio, the third of 5 children, in a household where money was never spoken about directly, only felt, in the specific silence that settled over the dinner table whenever a bill arrived that my father wasn't certain we could cover. My father worked at a glass factory for 31 years, and my mother took in sewing work on the side, careful, precise piecework that she did late at night after the rest of us had gone to bed. And I remember, even as a boy of 8 or 9, understanding without being told that money in our house was something you handled quietly, something you never discussed at a dinner table where other people might overhear the specific shape of your worry. That lesson, absorbed so early it never felt like a lesson at all, simply felt like the way the world worked, shaped nearly everything about how I would eventually handle money myself, decades later, in circumstances my parents could never have imagined. I enlisted in the Army in 1969, 18 years old, primarily because it offered a clear path forward that a factory town outside Zanesville simply didn't have much of at the time, and I served 4 years, including one deployment I still don't discuss in much detail, before returning home in 1973 with an interest, somewhat unusual for a young man of that era, in finance and numbers rather than anything more conventionally rugged. The Army, as it turned out, had assigned me for the final 2 years of my service to a role handling unit budgets and disbursement records, tedious work that most of my fellow soldiers considered a soft assignment compared to combat roles, but work that I found, to my own surprise, genuinely satisfying, the particular clarity of a ledger that either balanced or didn't, the specific discipline required to track every dollar to its precise, accountable destination. I want to be honest about something that shaped the rest of my life considerably. That 2-year assignment handling unit finances didn't just teach me bookkeeping. It taught me something about the specific power of money handled quietly and correctly, the way a well-managed budget could mean the difference between a unit having what it needed when it needed it, and a unit scrambling, exposed, unprepared. I carried that lesson home with me in 1973, and I used the GI Bill to attend Ohio State, earning a degree in finance in 1977, a degree that felt, at the time, like a fairly unremarkable credential compared to what some of my more ambitious classmates were pursuing, but one that would eventually open a door I hadn't fully anticipated. I took a position at a regional bank in Columbus in 1978, starting in a fairly junior role processing loan applications, and over the following 34 years, I built a career there that most people, understandably, find considerably less interesting to discuss than more dramatic professional paths. I want to tell you specifically about the shape of that career, because it matters enormously to understanding everything that happened decades later. I spent the majority of those years, particularly the final 2 decades before my retirement in 2012, working in the bank's Trust and Estate Division, a department responsible for managing the financial affairs of clients who, for one reason or another, needed careful, discreet, long-term stewardship of significant assets, elderly clients without close family to help them, families navigating complicated inheritances, business owners planning for succession, situations that required not just technical financial competence, but a particular kind of quiet judgment, an ability to see the full shape of someone's financial life and make recommendations that serve their genuine long-term interest rather than any more immediate or convenient outcome. I remember the specific weight of that work, the particular responsibility of sitting across a desk from a widow in her 80s who had never once, across an entire marriage, handled her own family's finances, and who was now depending on me to help her understand decisions that would shape the remainder of her life. I remember advising a family of 4 adult siblings through the difficult, often contentious process of settling their father's estate, holding a room together through arguments that had nothing, really, to do with money and everything to do with old grievances the money had simply given a convenient shape to. I took that responsibility seriously, understanding that the specific recommendations I made, the specific numbers I helped people understand, could mean the difference between financial security and genuine hardship for people who had trusted me with information they hadn't shared with almost anyone else in their lives. I want to be honest about the actual nature of that discretion, because I think it's easy for people to assume that a career spent quietly managing other people's money is somehow less consequential than more visible, more dramatic work. In some ways, that's true. There were no headlines, no dramatic stories I could tell at dinner parties. But in other ways, the decisions I helped shape across those 34 years determined the entire remaining trajectory of dozens of families' financial lives, and the discretion required of that work, the specific habit of never discussing client details, never volunteering information about who I'd helped or how, became, over time, something closer to a personality trait than a professional obligation. I retired in 2012 as a senior trust officer, and I want to be clear that this particular career, unlike something more visibly heroic, produced no medals, no dramatic recognition, simply the quiet, largely invisible knowledge that I'd spent 3.5 decades trying to help people navigate some of the most consequential financial decisions of their lives with the specific care I believed those decisions deserved. I met my wife Carol in 1976, during my final year at Ohio State, and we married the following year, shortly before I started at the bank. Carol worked as a school librarian for nearly 3 decades, patient and perceptive in ways that complemented my own more reserved temperament, and she carried, throughout our 46 years of marriage until her passing 4 years ago, a genuine understanding that certain parts of my professional life simply weren't meant to be discussed in detail, an understanding she never pushed against, trusting instead that whatever discretion I maintained about client matters was mine to manage in my own professional way. I want to be honest about something else, something that matters considerably to understanding the rest of this story. Carol and I were, by the standards of most people around us, remarkably careful with money throughout our entire marriage, not out of any dramatic financial hardship, but out of the specific habits absorbed early, the same quiet discipline I'd learned watching my own parents manage a factory income decades earlier. We drove modest cars well past the point most people would have traded them in. We took vacations that were pleasant but rarely extravagant. We lived, for most of our married life, in a comfortable but unremarkable 3-bedroom house in a middle-class neighborhood outside Columbus, the kind of house that gave absolutely no visible indication of what our actual financial picture looked like underneath. And underneath, over those 34 years, between Carol's careful household budgeting, my own bank salary and eventual promotions, and decades of disciplined, unglamorous investing, largely in low-cost index funds, and a handful of carefully chosen individual positions I'd researched with the same discipline I brought to my professional work, we had built something considerably more substantial than either our lifestyle or our public presentation ever suggested. We had one son, Marcus, born in 1979, And I want to be honest that raising him, particularly during the years I was building my career at the bank, working long hours that occasionally kept me away from dinner, more evenings than I would have liked, created its own particular pattern in our relationship, one I don't think either of us fully addressed until very recently. I remember specific stretches of Marcus's childhood, arriving home some evenings after he'd already gone to bed, carrying case files I could never adequately explain to him, even if I'd wanted to, given the strict confidentiality my profession required. Carol would gently manage those gaps on my behalf, offering Marcus some general, age-appropriate reassurance that Dad's work mattered, even when Dad himself seemed frustratingly unavailable to explain exactly how. Marcus grew up, as a result, with a fairly thin understanding of what I actually did for a living, knowing only the vaguest outline, that I worked at a bank, that I helped people with their money in some capacity he never developed much curiosity about, an understandable gap given how little I'd ever volunteered to fill it. He built his own career eventually in commercial real estate, a field with its own visible, measurable markers of success, closed deals, commission checks, a title on a business card that meant something specific and legible to the people around him. He married his wife Danielle in 2008, a warm, capable woman I'd genuinely come to like over the years, and they had 2 children together, my grandchildren, Sophie and Owen, now 11 and 8, who I see with real regularity and genuine affection, even if my relationship with their father has always carried, underneath the surface warmth, a particular quality of distance neither of us fully addressed. I want to be fair to Marcus here, because it would be easy to paint him simply as unkind, and that isn't the complete picture of who he actually is. He's been, in most respects, a devoted son and father, someone who calls regularly, who invites me to every holiday and every grandchild's school event without fail, who has never once, across his entire adult life, been anything approaching cruel to me in any deliberate sense. What I've noticed, though, particularly over the past decade since my retirement, is a certain pattern in how Marcus discusses my financial circumstances, an assumption, unspoken but increasingly evident, that a retired bank employee living on a modest pension and Social Security necessarily meant tight, unremarkable financial resources, an assumption built almost entirely on the visible evidence of our modest house, our older cars, and Carol's and my consistently frugal lifestyle, an assumption that had never once been directly tested against our actual situation, simply because the topic had never arisen in a context that required correction. I think it's important, before I tell you about that Christmas dinner, that I explain something about the specific financial decision that eventually became the center of this entire story. In 2019, Marcus and Danielle purchased a house in a good school district outside Columbus, a genuinely solid decision for their family, but one that stretched their finances considerably, requiring a mortgage of just under $200,000 at a rate that, by the time interest rates began climbing significantly in 2022 and 2023, had started to feel, according to comments Marcus made offhandedly at several family gatherings, like a real strain on their monthly budget, particularly with Sophie approaching the age where private tutoring and extracurricular costs were beginning to add up, and with Danielle having recently reduced her own working hours to spend more time with the children. I never asked Marcus directly about the specifics of their financial pressure. That wasn't how our relationship worked, and frankly, decades of professional discretion had made me somewhat reluctant to insert myself uninvited into anyone's private financial situation, even my own son's. But I listened. The way I'd spent 34 years listening to clients describe their circumstances in the specific, careful language people use when they're worried but don't want to sound worried, and over the course of about 18 months, I began to understand, without ever being told directly, that the mortgage on that house had become a genuine, ongoing source of stress in my son's household, the kind of stress that shapes small daily decisions and quiet arguments in ways that never get discussed openly at a family dinner. I want to be honest about the specific process that led to what I eventually did, because I think it matters to understanding why I made the choice I made, and why I made it the way I made it. Carol passed in the spring of 2020, after a difficult 18-month decline that I won't describe in detail here, And in the aftermath of her death, I found myself, for the first time in my adult life, sitting alone with the full, unobstructed picture of our combined finances. Finances that Carol and I had always managed together, but that I now had to review entirely on my own. What I found, sitting at that kitchen table in the months after her passing, going through statements and account summaries with a kind of grim, grief-driven thoroughness, was that Carol's and my decades of quiet, disciplined saving had left me, at 71 years old, with considerably more financial security than either of us had ever discussed openly, even with each other in any explicit dollar amount sense: a retirement account, a modest pension, Social Security, and an investment portfolio that had grown, through decades of unglamorous compounding, into something that could comfortably support my own remaining years many times over, with a substantial surplus left beyond anything I could reasonably expect to need. I sat with that realization for a long time, genuinely uncertain, in the specific way that grief makes even straightforward decisions feel complicated, about what I actually wanted to do with a surplus I'd never expected to have to think about this directly. I considered various options over the following 2 years: charitable giving, which I did increase somewhat, a more formal estate plan for Sophie and Owen's eventual education, which I also began setting up. But the specific idea of paying off Marcus's mortgage began forming sometime in early 2023, after a Sunday dinner where Marcus mentioned, almost in passing, doing some quick mental math out loud about how much of their monthly income was going toward mortgage interest at their specific rate. A comment he clearly didn't intend as any kind of appeal for help, simply an offhand frustration shared the way people share small daily stresses with family, but a comment that stayed with me for weeks afterward. I want to be honest about why I ultimately decided to do this quietly, without telling Marcus in advance, rather than simply offering the money directly and letting him decide whether to accept it. Part of this reflected genuine uncertainty about how Marcus would respond to a direct offer. I suspected, correctly as it turned out, that he would have significant pride around accepting that kind of help, that a direct conversation might have produced weeks of uncomfortable negotiation, false reassurances that they didn't really need it, an entire dynamic I genuinely wanted to avoid. But if I'm honest with myself, part of it also reflected the same deep pattern that had shaped my entire career, and in many ways, my entire approach to my own family. A genuine comfort with quiet, unacknowledged action, a preference for letting outcomes speak for themselves rather than announcing intentions in advance. It was, I recognize now, both a genuine act of love and, in its own way, a continuation of exactly the same discretion that had left Marcus with such a thin understanding of who I actually was and what I was actually capable of. In June of 2023, I contacted Marcus's mortgage servicer directly, using authorization I was able to establish through my decades of banking relationships and a limited power of attorney Marcus had actually granted me years earlier for an unrelated matter involving his own father-in-law's estate. Documentation that technically permitted me to inquire about and act on certain of his financial accounts under specific circumstances. A legal detail I want to be transparent about because I don't want anyone thinking I did this through some improper or secretive channel. I confirmed the exact remaining balance, $162,411, and on June 14, 2023, I wired the full amount directly to the mortgage servicer, instructing them to apply it as a full payoff of the loan and to process any resulting paperwork through their standard channels, rather than through any special notification that might have tipped Marcus off in advance about where the payment had originated. I remember sitting at my kitchen table that afternoon after confirming the transfer had gone through, feeling something I hadn't quite expected. Not pride exactly, and not even primarily satisfaction, but something closer to a kind of quiet completion. The sense of having finally done something concrete with decades of careful, disciplined saving that had otherwise simply continued accumulating in accounts Marcus knew almost nothing about. I remember thinking at the time that I would probably tell him eventually, once the mortgage servicer's paperwork worked its way through their system and he noticed the loan had been paid off, that I would simply explain, calmly, what I'd done and why. I genuinely did not anticipate that 6 months would pass without Marcus mentioning anything at all, and I certainly did not anticipate the specific way the full picture would eventually come to light. What I later learned, once the full story finally surfaced, was that Marcus and Danielle's mortgage servicer had, in fact, sent formal notification of the payoff to their address in late June of 2023, a standard letter confirming the loan had been satisfied in full, along with a note about the release of the property lien. Danielle, as it turned out, had opened that particular piece of mail during an especially chaotic week involving Owen's tonsillectomy and a work deadline of her own, glanced at it without fully processing what it actually said, assumed it was some kind of routine refinancing document related to a rate adjustment they'd been discussing with their servicer months earlier, and set it aside in a stack of papers that eventually migrated into a drawer in their home office, unread in any real detail by either Marcus or Danielle, sitting there for the following 18 months as an entirely unexamined piece of evidence about a debt that, unbeknownst to either of them, no longer technically existed. Marcus, meanwhile, continued making mortgage payments for the following several months, a detail that still, honestly, makes me smile with a kind of rueful affection whenever I think about it. Payments that the mortgage servicer, through what I later learned was an administrative processing gap on their end, involving the specific way the payoff had been applied against an account that technically remained open for a brief window during their internal reconciliation process, simply redirected into a suspense account rather than immediately flagging for Marcus's attention, an unusual but not entirely unheard of banking quirk that meant Marcus continued believing, for months, that he was making regular payments against a mortgage that had, in fact, already been fully satisfied. I want to pause here and be honest about something. I did not know during those months that any of this administrative confusion was happening. I assumed, reasonably but incorrectly, that Marcus had received the standard payoff notification, understood immediately what had happened, and was simply, for reasons of his own pride or discomfort, choosing not to bring it up with me directly, an assumption that fit comfortably enough with our general pattern of not discussing significant financial matters openly, that I didn't think to question it. I genuinely believed, walking into that Christmas dinner, that my son already knew exactly what I'd done for him 6 months earlier, and that his continued silence on the matter simply reflected his own particular way of processing something he perhaps found difficult to fully acknowledge. This is the context you need to understand what happened at that Christmas dinner, because without it, a folded $40 check and a short, sharp laugh don't carry anywhere near the weight they're actually supposed to carry. We gathered, as we did every year, at Marcus and Danielle's house on Christmas Eve, a tradition that had continued unbroken since before Carol's passing, though the specific texture of the day had changed considerably since I began attending as a widower rather than as part of a couple. The house was warm and full of the particular chaos of 2 young children on Christmas Eve, Sophie and Owen tearing through the living room in matching pajamas, Danielle managing a ham in the kitchen with the specific harried competence of someone hosting 8 people, Marcus's brother-in-law and his family also present that year, adding to the general noise and warmth of the evening. Gift-giving in our family had always followed a fairly consistent pattern. The grandchildren received the bulk of everyone's attention and spending, appropriately, while the adults exchanged smaller, more modest gifts, often practical items or small checks, a tradition I'd maintained with Marcus specifically since he'd turned 18, a $40 check every Christmas, an amount that had never changed in over 3 decades. Not because I couldn't afford more, but because it had become, over the years, less about the actual dollar amount and more about a small, consistent ritual between us. The same $40 I'd started giving him as a young man just out of high school, a number that had simply never felt like it needed updating, the way certain small family traditions persist long after their original practical logic has faded. I want to be honest that I hadn't thought much, going into that particular Christmas, about how that small, consistent gift might land differently given everything else happening beneath the surface. I handed Marcus the envelope sometime after dinner, during the general unwrapping chaos in the living room, the same plain envelope I'd used every year, containing the same folded check, and I genuinely expected the same mild, appreciative nod he'd given me every Christmas for the past 3 decades. Instead, Marcus opened the envelope, glanced at the check, and let out a short, sharp laugh, the kind of laugh that carries real surprise rather than genuine amusement, and said, loudly enough that Danielle and both of his in-laws clearly heard him, "$40, Dad? Seriously? I mean, I appreciate the thought, but come on. We're not exactly rolling in it over here with this mortgage. You'd think $40 a year could at least go up with inflation at some point." He said it with a laugh, the way you might make a lighthearted joke at a family gathering, clearly without any real malice. But the comment landed in the room with a specific, uncomfortable weight. Danielle's brother-in-law chuckling awkwardly, Danielle herself shooting Marcus a quick, faintly embarrassed look before busying herself with one of the children's discarded wrapping paper. I sat there, 74 years old, holding my own cup of coffee, absorbing the particular sting of watching my son casually characterize a decades-old tradition, one that had always meant considerably more to me than its dollar amount suggested, as somehow evidence of my own financial limitation. Spoken in front of extended family, 6 months after I had quietly wired him $162,000 without ever once mentioning it, an amount that, in that specific moment, felt suddenly, sharply relevant in a way I hadn't anticipated needing to bring up at all. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't primarily anger, though a real sting was certainly present, sharper than I expected given how thoroughly I'd convinced myself Marcus already understood what I'd done. What I felt was something closer to confusion, a specific, disorienting confusion. The sense that I was suddenly standing in a conversation where the two of us were operating from completely different sets of facts, though I had no way of knowing, in that exact moment, exactly how different those facts actually were. "Marcus," I said, keeping my voice as level and mild as I could manage, "I think there might be something we need to talk about regarding that mortgage." "What do you mean?" Marcus said, still smiling slightly, clearly assuming I was about to make some kind of gentle joke back at him about the $40. "Don't worry about it, Dad. I was just giving you a hard time." "No," I said, "I mean the mortgage itself. Marcus, when was the last time you actually looked at your mortgage statement?" I want to describe the specific shift in Marcus's expression at that question, because I've thought about it many times since. His smile faded slightly, replaced by a kind of confused uncertainty, the particular look of someone trying to figure out whether a conversation has suddenly become more serious than they initially understood. "I mean, I get the statement every month," he said. "Why?" "Do you actually read it?" I asked. "Or do you just see the payment amount and assume everything's the same as it's always been?" Danielle, who had come back into the room during this exchange, was watching us now with a growing, visible unease. "Frank, what's going on?" she asked. I took a breath, genuinely uncertain, in that specific moment, how to proceed, whether to simply explain directly in front of everyone or ask to speak with Marcus privately, and ultimately decided that whatever confusion existed clearly needed to be resolved with both of them present, given that the mortgage was, after all, their shared household finance. "Marcus," I said, "in June, I paid off your mortgage in full. I wired the entire remaining balance directly to your servicer. I assumed, when you never mentioned it, that you'd received their notification and simply hadn't wanted to bring it up directly with me. I didn't realize, until right now, that you might not actually know." The room went genuinely, completely silent. The specific kind of silence that happens when several people are simultaneously trying to process information that doesn't yet fit into their existing understanding of a situation. Danielle's brother-in-law, sensing the sudden shift, quietly ushered his own family toward the kitchen, giving us space, while Sophie and Owen, still absorbed in their new toys, remained blissfully unaware in the corner of the living room. "That's not," Marcus said slowly, "that's not possible, Dad. I made a payment last week. I make a payment every single month. There's no way you paid it off in June and I'm still just what? Sending money into nothing?" "Get the statement," I said gently. "Get the actual paper statement, not just the app on your phone. I want you to look at it closely." Danielle was already moving toward the home office at that point, and I want to be honest that the following several minutes, while Marcus and Danielle searched through their file drawer, first for recent statements and then, once Danielle remembered it, for the specific piece of mail she'd set aside back in June without reading it fully, were some of the more genuinely tense minutes of my adult life, sitting in that living room with my grandchildren, playing obliviously nearby, uncertain exactly what my son was about to discover or how he was going to respond to discovering it. Danielle found the June letter first, still sitting essentially untouched in the drawer where she'd filed it 18 months earlier during that chaotic week with Owen's surgery. I watched her open it, watched her read it once quickly and then a second time more slowly, watched the specific color drain slightly from her face as the actual content of the letter finally registered. "Marcus," she said, her voice tight, "this is a payoff confirmation. From June. It says the loan is paid in full." Marcus took the letter from her hands and read it himself, and I watched my son's expression move through a rapid, visible sequence of confusion, disbelief, and something that looked, by the end, increasingly like genuine shock. "This says June 14th, he said quietly, almost to himself. "I've been making payments for 18 months on a mortgage that doesn't exist anymore?" "The servicer apparently had some kind of processing gap," I said. "I only just learned this myself, right now, watching you read that letter. I genuinely assumed, this entire time, that you knew, that you'd received this exact notification back in June, and simply chosen not to say anything to me about it." "Why would I not say anything about that?" Marcus said, his voice rising slightly, not with anger at me exactly, but with the specific disorientation of someone trying to process an enormous piece of missing information all at once. "Dad, why would you do this and not tell me? Why would you let me keep making payments for a year and a half?" I want to be honest about how I answered that question, because I think my answer matters to understanding this entire story. "I didn't let you," I said. "I had no idea you were still making payments. I assumed the payoff had processed cleanly and that you knew immediately. As for why I didn't tell you directly when I did it, Marcus, I think if I'm honest with myself, it's the same reason I've never talked much about most of what I actually did across 34 years at that bank. I'm not naturally someone who announces things. I've spent my entire adult life handling significant financial matters quietly, and somewhere along the way, that became simply how I approach everything, including things that maybe deserved a more direct conversation with my own son." Marcus sat down slowly on the arm of the couch, still holding the letter, and for a long moment, nobody said anything. Danielle sat down beside him, her hand finding his, both of them staring at that single piece of paper as though it might resolve itself into something more comprehensible if they looked at it long enough. "I called you a broke old veteran, Dad," Marcus said finally. "Wait, I want to correct myself here as I tell you this story. That particular phrase wasn't actually what he said that night. That's not accurate to what happened. Let me tell you exactly what he said instead. I made a joke about your $40 Christmas check 20 minutes ago," Marcus said, in front of everyone, basically implying you were being cheap, while you'd already paid off my entire mortgage 6 months earlier and never said a single word about it. "I feel like the worst son alive right now." "You're not the worst son alive," I said. "You made a joke based on the information you actually had, which was incomplete information, through no fault of your own. I'm not upset with you for the joke, Marcus. I want to be honest about that. What I actually feel right now isn't hurt about the check. It's something more like recognizing, all over again, how much of my actual life you simply don't have access to, because I've never given you access to it, not because I don't trust you, but because discretion has become such a deep habit for me that I sometimes forget it needs to be balanced against actually letting the people I love understand who I am." Danielle was crying quietly at this point, and she reached over and took my hand. "Frank," she said, "do you have any idea what this takes off us? The stress this mortgage has caused, especially this past year? We've had actual arguments about money because of this exact payment, not knowing it didn't even need to be made anymore." I didn't fully understand how much strain it was actually causing. I said, not in specific numbers. I understood there was strain, in the general way you pick up on these things within a family, but I don't think I appreciated the full daily weight of it until right now, watching both of your faces. Marcus, still processing, looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen from him in years, something raw and unguarded that reminded me, oddly, of him as a much younger man. "Dad," he said, "I've spent years assuming you and Mom were basically getting by on a pension and Social Security. Just comfortable enough, nothing more. I never once thought to ask you real questions about what you'd actually built over your career, because I built this whole picture in my head based on the house, the cars, how careful you and Mom always were about spending. I never once considered that the actual scope of what you'd saved might be considerably larger than whatever assumption I'd built." "You're right that we were careful," I said. "That much of your assumption was accurate. But careful and limited aren't the same thing, Marcus. Your mother and I spent 46 years being disciplined with money, specifically so that we would eventually have the freedom to do exactly what I did in June, to make a real difference for someone we loved, without it threatening our own security at all. That discipline wasn't a sign of struggle. It was the entire point. We talked for nearly 3 hours that evening, long after Danielle's brother-in-law's family had said their goodbyes and Sophie and Owen had finally been put to bed, exhausted from the excitement of the day. I told Marcus, in detail I'd genuinely never shared with him before, about the specific shape of my career at the bank, about the widow I'd helped through her husband's complicated estate in 1994, about the family of 4 siblings I'd helped keep from tearing each other apart over their father's inheritance in 2003. About the particular discipline Carol and I had built together across decades of careful saving, never once discussing specific dollar amounts with him because the topic had simply never come up in a way that required it. I also told him, for the first time in any real detail, about the process that had led to the mortgage payoff itself, about sitting alone at that kitchen table in the months after Carol's death, confronting the full scope of what we'd actually built together, about the specific comment he'd made months earlier about mortgage interest that had stayed with me, about deciding, ultimately, that quiet action felt more genuine to me than any kind of announced gesture, a decision I acknowledged. By the end of that conversation, I might have handled differently if I'd fully understood how much confusion my silence would eventually create. "I want you to understand something, Marcus," I said, toward the end of that long conversation. "My worth was never contingent on this coming to light the way it did tonight. I didn't need you to discover this, and I certainly didn't do it hoping for some dramatic reveal. I would have been perfectly content if the mortgage servicer's paperwork had simply worked correctly back in June, if you'd quietly noticed the payoff, called to thank me, and we'd moved on with our lives. But I also want you to understand that the discretion I've carried across my entire career, and frankly across most of my relationship with you, has its limits, and tonight taught me something about where those limits actually are." Marcus nodded slowly. "I think I've spent years measuring what you and Mom had through a fairly narrow lens," he said. "The house, the cars, the small gifts, and I never once considered that the actual scope of what you'd built might be entirely different from what that surface picture suggested. I'm ashamed of that joke tonight, Dad, especially now, understanding what you'd actually done for us 6 months before I ever opened my mouth about it. In the 2 months since that Christmas, something has genuinely shifted in how Marcus relates to me. He calls considerably more often now, not just for logistics or holiday coordination, but to actually talk, asking real questions about my career at the bank, about specific decisions I made across those 34 years, about what it actually felt like to help people navigate some of the most significant financial moments of their lives. He's asked, more than once, whether I'd be willing to sit down with him properly and walk through our family's actual full financial picture together. Not because he expects or wants anything further from me, he's been genuinely clear about that, but because he says he wants to actually understand who I am, rather than continuing to operate from assumptions built on the surface of things. Danielle, for her part, sent me a card about 3 weeks after Christmas that I've kept on my kitchen counter since, a handwritten note thanking me not just for the financial relief, though she was genuinely deeply grateful for that, but for what she described as showing her something important about the kind of quiet, patient love that doesn't need to announce itself to be real. She mentioned that the mortgage stress had, in ways she hadn't fully realized until it lifted, been affecting her marriage in small, corrosive ways she was only now beginning to understand clearly now that the weight was gone. I want to be honest that Marcus and Danielle have also, since that Christmas, made some changes I genuinely didn't expect, but have found quietly moving to witness. They redirected the money that had been going toward mortgage payments into a proper college fund for Sophie and Owen, a decision Marcus told me about with real pride during a recent phone call, and they've started what Danielle jokingly calls actual money conversations between the two of them. A habit she says they'd never really built in 15 years of marriage, largely because money had always felt like a source of quiet stress rather than something you discussed openly and calmly together. I've also noticed, in the months since, that Marcus has started speaking differently about my career to his own friends and colleagues, describing me now with a considerably more accurate understanding, someone who spent 34 years quietly helping people navigate significant financial decisions, and who, in his own words during a conversation I happened to overhear at a recent dinner, actually knows what he's talking about when it comes to money, way more than I ever gave him credit for. Sophie, my 11-year-old granddaughter, asked me a few weeks ago, with the particular directness that children sometimes bring to conversations adults tend to complicate unnecessarily, whether I was rich. I told her I was comfortable, that your grandmother and I had worked very hard and saved very carefully for a very long time, and that comfortable, real comfortable, the kind built slowly and quietly over decades, was worth considerably more than looking rich ever could be. She seemed to accept this answer with the easy acceptance children bring to most explanations adults offer them, and went back to whatever she'd been doing before she asked. But I found myself thinking about that exchange for days afterward, wondering how much of what I'd just told her was actually a lesson I'd only fully learned myself at 74 years old, sitting in my son's living room on Christmas Eve, watching him read a letter that had been sitting unread in a drawer for 18 months. I don't tell you this story because I want credit for paying off my son's mortgage, or because I think quiet generosity needs an audience to matter. I tell you this story because I want you to understand something important. The specific habit of discretion, the quiet, careful management of significant things without announcement or acknowledgement, can become, if you're not careful, a habit that costs you something important. The chance for the people you love to actually understand the full shape of who you are and what you're capable of, while they're still forming their assumptions about you, rather than after those assumptions have already calcified into casual, careless jokes at a Christmas dinner table. I spent decades believing that quiet generosity was somehow more genuine than announced generosity, that doing good without acknowledgement was inherently more virtuous than doing good openly. I still believe there's real truth in that instinct. But I've also learned, at 74 years old, that quiet can tip over into something closer to invisibility if you're not careful, and that the people who love you deserve at least the chance to actually see you clearly, rather than being left to fill in the considerable gaps with whatever assumptions the surface of your life happens to suggest. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life whose actual generosity or actual strength you might not fully understand, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and subscribe, because we have a new story like this one every week.